Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Mr. Bruce. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. When I was young, I've packed a lot of living into my short life. Thanks to my lifestyle a few years back, by choice I was homeless for 5 years. I roamed the United States with nothing but a backpack. Starting in Alabama, I journeyed west to California, then made my way back east to South Carolina. Each mile was an adventure and every town a story. I'd settle briefly, find work, and then, as comfort set in, I'd move on. My life was a whirlwind of experiences. It's not just something I say, I genuinely felt it. I lived deeply and fully. But that lifestyle came with some big monsters. I had to abandon it, or it would have killed me. The story I'm sharing is the exact moment I decided to leave it all behind, and why. It was midsummer. I was walking along a desolate stretch of road deep in the countryside of South Carolina. Most of the road was bordered on both sides by thick forest with the occasional patch of farmland. The sun blazed down relentlessly. The grass along the side of the road was wild and unkempt. The locals said it was called prickle grass, and for good reason. As I trudged through it, the grass whipped against my legs, sending a burning itch up my calves. I rarely played road roulette, which is what I called hitchhiking, but the heat was unbearable and my legs were breaking out in welts. I needed a ride, even if just for a few miles, so I began thumbing for passing vehicles. Unfortunately, they were few and far between. A blue blob began to take shape through the wavy blur of the horizon. As it got closer, I could make out the distinct shape of a powder blue Wrangler Unlimited. I stuck out my thumb. "Fish on," I muttered to myself, but the Jeep sped past me. "Well, crap," I whispered. "Fish gone." Then suddenly the driver slammed on the brakes, and the Jeep squealed to a stop. They didn't pull over. They just sat in the middle of the lane. Unsure whether it was an invitation or car trouble, I watched as the driver's side door swung open and a hand waved me over. I hiked up my backpack and ran to the Jeep. "Thank God," I sighed. As I reached the vehicle, I noticed a sticker on the rear swing gate that read, "Honk if you love Jesus," with the word Jesus shaped like a fish. I patted the back, signaling for the driver to unlock it. The driver leaned out from the open door. "No room back there, pal. Just throw your bag in the back seat." Peeking through the rear window, I spotted what looked like a massive pile of clothes or maybe blankets. It was hard to tell through the dark tint. I circled to the passenger side, heard the click of the lock, and tossed my bag into the back. Reaching for the door handle, I muttered, "Here's to hoping the chamber's empty," as I swung the door open and slid into the passenger seat. Inside, the Jeep was pristine. The dashboard was a parade of rubber ducks with a cheerful solar flower dancing in the center. The air was thick with the scent of warm vanilla. I knew the fragrance well. It was my ex's favorite. Hanging from the rearview mirror was a delicate cross necklace, its thin chain catching the light as I settled in. Sitting behind the wheel was a disheveled bear of a man. He was massive, wearing a dirty, slightly torn plaid button-up shirt. His black hair was beginning to gray in places, and his thick beard was unruly. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing thick, hairy arms and a long scratch running down his right forearm. He looked like he'd been working in the fields. Seeing him in the vehicle made me choke back a laugh. "Where are you headed, Pilgrim?" he asked, pulling a pack of cowboy killers out of his shirt pocket and slapping it repeatedly on his palm. "Thanks for stopping. I heard there's a town out this way called Carver's Bay." "Yep, sure is. It's a regular spit on the map. What are you heading out there for?" he asked. "I was told there's always easy work out there." He chuckled. "Easy? No, work yes. Work's work, and I need some cash before heading to Georgia." "Well, Carver's Bay it is then. I was kinda heading that way anyhow," he said, flicking his lighter and lighting his cigarette. He offered me the pack. "Want one?" "No thanks, I don't smoke." "You'll outlive us all," he said, tucking the pack back into his pocket. I'd roll the window down, but this darn thing doesn't have any window switches. "Sure it does," I said, pointing. "Because the doors come off, Jeeps have them on the dashboard." He looked down. "Oh, what do you know? Thanks." "New vehicle?" I asked. "Yeah, just got it," he muttered, rolling his window down. We rode down the desolate road for the first few minutes in silence. Then a brief shimmer of the cross swaying like a pendulum around the rearview mirror caught my attention. "Are you a believer?" I asked, nodding to the tiny golden cross. He smirked. "Sure, a believer, but not a follower." Interesting response, I thought. Sounds like there's a story there. He fiddled with his air vent. "Nope, it's simple. I believe in God and I hate everything about him." That struck me as odd. "Then why have the cross?" He paused. "Are you Catholic?" "No," I replied. "Well, Catholics say a cross without Christ's body is just a torture symbol. I like that idea." I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed quiet. The awkward silence stretched until he broke it. It's not mine anyway, so it doesn't really matter." "Oh, whose is it then?" He stiffened, not caught off guard, just stiff like a soldier at attention. Clearing his throat, he replied, "It belonged to someone I knew briefly and intensely." "How about you? Are you a believer?" He turned and asked. "Sometimes. I guess I'm in the same boat as you. I believe, but I don't really follow anymore," I said. "Why?" he pressed. "I don't really know. It's not one thing. It's a lot of little things that make it hard to keep the faith," I mumbled, hesitant to get too personal. "Oh, come on, give me something." He leaned in, smiling. "It was gradual," I continued. "I stopped going to church, then praying. I read more, learned about different philosophies and religions. The contradictions, the suffering, God's silence, it all didn't add up. Sorry, bud, but I call bull crap," he said, leaning back. I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "You're not a believer who stopped following. You're a follower who stopped believing. Big difference, pal," he said. I thought about that. Yeah, I guess so. No guessing about it. You want to follow, but you've lost your motivation. But me, I know he's up there, sitting on his throne with everyone telling him how great he is, how wonderful he is, how full of crap he is, he huffed. His freaking vanity. "That's why being vain is the cardinal sin, because it's his," he said. The lines in his hand and the muscles in his forearm started to protrude as he gripped the wheel tighter. "You know, my favorite part of the Bible is the story of Moses and the Pharaoh," he said, "but when I read it, I don't see the tale of Moses who conquered Egypt with God's might. I see a king who stood before the wrath of God, and rather than bend to his will, chose to be broken by it. A man's strength can never overcome the power of God, but it can spit in the eye of it." I was starting to get really concerned. This guy seemed off, and the more we talked, the worse it got. We had just blown past a sign that read, "Carver's Bay 5 miles," with an arrow pointing right. It was clear he had changed his mind about where we were going. All I could do was agree with him to keep him calm. "Yeah, I guess technically you're right. That's why I stopped following too." "But you didn't," he shot back, staring at me. "Yes, I did," I began, but he cut me off. "I already told you. You don't believe anymore, but you still want to follow. Blind faith. There's nothing worse than that." He was starting to look different. His expression turned wild, and he began twitching the sides of his mouth. Something unsettling was seeping to the surface. "If you say so," I replied. Yes, I do say so." He hadn't broken eye contact with me, not once looking at the road. "Would you mind paying attention, please?" I tried to lighten the instruction, or else we both might meet the big hypocrite sooner than later. "I'd love nothing more," he responded, but he did turn his head back straight. I was trying to figure out how to get out of this car. I had no idea where we were heading. I even entertained jumping out, but I knew that only worked in movies. Keeping his head forward, he said, "Do you remember when I told you that cross didn't belong to me?" Hesitantly, I replied, "Yeah." "Well, what if I told you it came with the car?" "What do you mean?" Tilting his head, he cut his eyes at me. "You know exactly what I mean." "I really don't," I said. "I saw you look in the back earlier," he replied. "You saw her, didn't you?" I had no idea what he was talking about. "Saw who?" I asked. "Keep playing dumb and see where that gets you," he said. "All that was back there was a pile of blankets," I said. "No, you saw what was under them. It's okay, I wanted you to see. You're just like her. I knew it the moment I saw you back there," he said. I didn't know what to do or say, so I said the only thing I could. Please pull over. I'd like to get out. Sorry, bud. This ride is yours whether you want it or not. We've got a journey to finish, you and me, and it's staying on course until we reach the end. He lowered his left hand from the wheel and reached down between the door and his seat, bringing up a gun. Whoa, man, freaking chill. What's your problem? I don't have a problem, he shouted. I tried to remain calm, but my insides were churning into knots. I hate God. I hate him so much, and I can't blow his brains out, but yours I can. And I can give you a little message to deliver when you see him. Dude, you need help. Just calm down, I pleaded. No, you're the one who needs help, he said. It's still inside you. He is still inside you. Destroy the vessel. Destroy the temple. What are you talking about? I asked. Don't you see? He's in all of you, walking around carrying that thing on the inside. I'll kill all of you if I have to. If you destroy the vessel, you destroy the temple. Destroy the temple. Destroy the faith. I will kill off the faith. I am his creation and his creation's reckoning. I didn't know what to do. He had a gun, and I had nothing to defend myself with. Trying to fight would likely end with me either getting shot or causing us to crash. And even if we did crash, he'd probably still have the gun. All options seemed to lead to my death. So I decided to keep talking, hoping I could find a way out. If that didn't work, I'd do whatever I had to do. Look, man, I get it. Life is unfair and miserable. And if God's to blame, then he's pretty terrible. But that doesn't mean you have to be terrible. You're being just like him. Oh, I'm not. I'm doing this world a favor by taking all of you pricks out of it. But what if you're wrong? I've told you I'm not the person you think I am. If you kill me, you'd be killing someone who's more like you than you realize. No, I know I'm right about you. But how can you be sure? What if you're wrong? Fine, I'll prove it. He cocked the hammer of the gun and handed it to me. Make your move, Pilgrim. Without hesitation, I pressed the barrel against his head and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing happened. He stared at me for a moment, then burst into uncontrollable laughter. Grabbing the gun from my hand, he said, "Good for you, pal. Good for you." He then put the barrel to his own head and pulled the trigger. Click, click, click. Still nothing. "The gun's not loaded, obviously," he said, pulling out a knife from his pocket. "Guns are noisy and leave too much evidence. Besides, you can't be as precise with a gun as you can with a well-sharpened blade." He slapped the pommel of the knife against the dashboard, angling the tip of the blade toward me. "But lucky for you, you passed." He slammed on the brakes, sending me flying towards the knife, but the seatbelt locked up, jerking me back into my seat. "Well, looky there. Seatbelts do save lives," he chuckled. "This is where you get your stuff and get out," he said. "But don't thank God. Thank yourself for saving you, not him. Carver's Bay is about 10 miles back that way. It's a bit of a walk, but use that time to think things over." I said nothing. I unclipped my seatbelt, jumped out, and grabbed my bags from the back seat. As I walked away from this nightmare, he put the Jeep in reverse, backing the passenger side door up to me. The window rolled down slowly. "Oh, and one more thing. Hitchhiking is a really stupid idea, pal. Don't you know there are some real crazies out there?" He winked at me and then drove off. I've shared this story with many people over the years, and a lot of them point out that I never actually saw a body in the back. They note that since the gun was unloaded and he never actually hurt me, it could have just been a sick joke from a twisted mind. But there's always that possibility that it was real. Honestly, I view it like a coin toss, 50-50. Whether it was a joke or something more sinister, it was enough for me to leave that life behind and settle down. People go missing all the time, never to be seen again. And who's to say some of those people didn't end up in a car with this freak, only they didn't pass his test? This happened to me a few weeks ago. I've been contemplating sending it, but I decided I would. So it was a sunny day, and I decided to go biking with my best friend. Let's call her Mona for the sake of this story. We go biking often as there's not much to do in the summer, and we live at opposite sides of town, so it's an easy way for a quick meetup for 5-6 hours. We usually meet up from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. and leave at 7-8 p.m. It's lots of fun, even if we just eat snacks at a nearby park. We usually have plans, but sometimes we don't do anything else except play in the park. We went to go buy snacks and then went to the park that we always go to. To get to the park, you have to ride through our school garden. And as we were riding through the school garden, Mona said she saw a figure inside the school. I honestly didn't believe her and thought she was lying because it was 8 p.m. and was trying to make things scary. I also thought it could have been her shadow, or she was seeing things. After playing in the park for a while, we both had to use the restroom. We weren't about to pee in a bush, so we decided to go back to our school. We arrived at the school quickly because the park is close to the school. We tried to open the doors, but they were locked. Then we rang the doorbell and Mona told me the sound reminded her of a nightmare. That's when we noticed the hall light was on. "That's weird, it shouldn't be on, it's motion detected," I said. Another thing I noticed after she rang the doorbell, which she hadn't seemed to notice until I pointed it out, was the banging from a window in the school. It sounded like someone aggressively shut the window, but I didn't remember it being open when we first arrived there. She rang it again and I heard another bang. This time I was looking in the direction of where the sound had came from, and the window was shut. We were certain no one was inside the school, because otherwise they would have already opened the door for us since we rang it twice. So I told her about the banging and we kept ringing the doorbell to see if it would happen again. Anytime we rang the doorbell, there would come a bang, sometimes more than one. At one point we started recording and the banging actually calmed down. That scared me even more. Not even a minute after we stopped recording, people walked by. There was another bang as we had just rang the doorbell. I heard them say, "Oh wow, the window was open." I don't know why, but this made me angry. There were clearly no windows open, and even if there would have been, that wouldn't explain it shutting by itself since there was no wind. We kept ringing the doorbell, but because it only came from one direction, I started to think it was someone playing a prank. I didn't know how or who, but I just thought it was a prank. But at one point when we rang the doorbell, the bangs went from one side of the school to another in under a second. This was what really got us, so we decided we'd try to catch whatever it was banging the windows. We rang the doorbell and ran far enough away so that we could see every window that had been hit. Nothing. We heard the sounds, but we didn't see anything. We rang the doorbell again and we were right in front of a window that got hit. But nothing. Not a single sign of anything. The glass wasn't even shaking. My dad called me a little while after the banging completely stopped, and I was kind of scared to ride home, but I made it home safely. Since that time we've been biking maybe twice, and both times we rang the doorbell, but there was no banging. What do you think it was? Our overreactive imagination, a ghost, a demon. Do you think our school is haunted? I don't know what it was, but I'll say, in the moment I wasn't scared. I like scary encounters. They leave good stories to tell around the campfire with your friends and family in the middle of the night. It was the summer of 1968. I was 8 years old and absolutely thrilled that school was out for the summer, and freedom was at hand. I loved my summers off and was looking forward to all types of adventures with my cousin Jimmy. Jimmy was 6 months older than me and lived 4 houses down. Our families were very close and took vacations together and celebrated holidays with each other. So Jimmy and I were tight. We were best friends. As great as I knew my upcoming summer was going to be, who could have thought it would get even better? Well, it could, and it did. It was a typical summer day off in June, and Jimmy and I had been out playing all day in the warm summer sun. It was dinner time, though, and time to come in. During dinner, Mom told us kids that she had something exciting to tell us. She explained that she and Dad had gone together with my Aunt Buela and Uncle George, Jimmy's parents, and had purchased 2 adjacent 1-acre lots out in the country, and we were going to build a cabin. My Uncle George had mad carpenter skills, and my dad knew plumbing and electrical. It was meant to be. I was so excited. We would be staying in camper RVs. My little 8-year-old brain started spinning. Summers were going to be one big camping trip with swimming, fishing, and forests to explore. I was bursting with joy. Lake Lorelei was the name of the gated community where we had purchased the lots. It had just opened, and very few lots had been sold at that time. Lake Lorelei is located in Brown County, Ohio. It now consists of a population of over 1,000 and is completely developed. But back then, it was the middle of nowhere. The day came when we finally were able to see the property for the first time. Aunt Buela and Uncle George loaded up their camper, and my family did the same. Jimmy and I were more than excited, and the ride there was like waiting for Santa on Christmas Eve, endless. At last we arrived. Jimmy and I jumped out of our respective cars to inspect the area. We were ecstatic. None of the lots around us were inhabited. All the lots to the left and right of ours were lush fields of wildflowers, tall grasses, and butterflies. Across the road from the property, the lots were empty as well, and afforded a clear view of the pond across the street. About 5 lots down to the right was a small forest. My young brain did not question why those lots were not cleared to be sold. I was just excited that I had my own forest. Jimmy and I began exploring every nook and cranny immediately. We left after breakfast in the morning, came home for lunch, and was back out until dinner time. We loved it. One day we became curious as to the name, Lake Lorelei. Our parents explained to us that Lorelei was a siren from Norse mythology, who sat on the rocks along the Rhine River and sang so beautifully that sailors would be so enchanted that they would lose all their senses and crash their ships, only die watery deaths. We, of course, found this perfectly, gruesomely awesome. As the summer passed, we eventually headed down to explore the small forest that was 5 lots down from ours. As we entered the forest, a creepy feeling descended upon us, but we continued on our way. In the middle of the forest, we found a dilapidated, decaying old house. It was very quiet all around us. No chirping of birds or any other insect sounds. The ancient house seemed to be beckoning for us to come inside, but something about it made me feel uneasy, and I could tell Jimmy was feeling the same way. We looked at each other and said simultaneously, "I dare you to go in first." We laughed at that, and it somewhat eased the tension. It was a bright, sunny day, but the house sat in a dark, overgrown spot in the forest. We entered cautiously. The only audible sound was our footsteps as we stepped gingerly onto the creaky, rotting floorboards of the porch. The door was hanging off its hinges, and we just moved it aside and went into the house. The atmosphere changed immediately. It was even darker and felt cold, although it was 80 degrees outside. We stood still and just quietly looked around. Not much was left. Some broken pieces of wood furniture, bits of old paper, and cobwebs. Even though we were young, we were smart enough to know that the floor did not look safe, and we hoped there was no cellar. As my eyes scanned what once must have been the living room, I saw the corner of a black and white photo laying behind some cobwebs and old newspapers, beckoning me to come look at it. I made my way cautiously over to the picture, making sure with each step that the old boards would hold my childish weight. As I looked down at the picture, there was something compelling about it, and I reached down and snapped it up. It felt cold in my hands. The edges were tattered, but other than that, the picture had seemed to withstand the ravages of time. It was a photo of a beautiful woman sitting on a rock on the shore of what appeared to be a lake. Though the photo was in black and white, I could tell her hair was a very pale blonde. It was piled high on her head with bewitching tendrils escaping and hanging down to frame her face. I could also tell that her eyes were a light, icy blue. She had a slight smile on her face and was dressed elegantly in a long dress from an age long ago. As I continued to inspect the picture, Jimmy noticed and slowly headed over to see what I was looking at. Something about her was mesmerizing, but at the same, I felt icy shivers up and down my spine, and I rapidly dropped the photo. Jimmy reached down and picked it up, but I could tell he felt uncomfortable holding it as well. As he looked at the image in the picture, we began to hear light laughter. It was a woman's laugh. It was melodic, and just hearing it made you want to know the joke so you could join in. But suddenly the laughter began to change. It went from a beautiful musical sound to a wicked cackling noise. Jimmy and I were frozen in the spot, staring at each other with eyes as wide as saucers. Then the evil laughter turned into a high-pitched scream. We needed to hear no more. Jimmy quickly dropped the picture onto the floor, and we bolted to the crooked door, no longer concerned about the rotting floorboards. We slid the door to the side and began to run through the forest, as only 8-year-olds in great shape can run. We leapt over fallen logs, dashed through heavy overgrowth, and dodged branches until we could no longer hear the horrific screaming. Once we reached the tree line, it was like we crossed into a whole other world. Birds were chirping, butterflies were floating lazily on the gentle breeze, and the sun felt warm on our chilled skin. We slowed down to a walk, both of us quiet. Our uneasiness began to abate as we walked across the meadow, and we began talking about the whole experience. In our minds, the woman in the picture could only be Lorelei, the beautiful siren who lured sailors to their watery deaths. And as for the laughter and the scream, we both decided it would be best not to tell anyone, lest we be forbidden to explore and lose our freedom. But we never went back to those woods for the rest of the summer. Summer turned to fall and fall to winter, and we didn't visit Lake Lorelei near as often. As the school year passed slowly by, with each passing month I got more excited for summer in the cabin. Finally, summer arrived. A lot of progress has been made on the cabin, and I use that term loosely. As the foundation was down and the frame up, it was obvious it was going to be a big house. It consisted of 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a great room with a huge stone fireplace, and there was a porch that wrapped around 3/4 of the house. But it was not even close to being done. The shed was finished, though, and Jimmy and his parents slept in there, and my family still slept in the camper. Another great summer began at Lake Lorelei, and Jimmy and I were looking forward to the upcoming weekend. There was a carnival visiting the small town near us, and our cousin Cheryl was coming to spend the weekend. Although Cheryl was a mere 6 years old to our advanced 8 years, Jimmy and I enjoyed her company immensely, and were looking forward to showing her the property, and had many adventures planned. Cheryl was dropped off by her parents on Friday night, and we were up bright and early on Saturday morning. Jimmy and I had so much to show her. We took her to the small pond, the cool dam where the water trickled down to the big lake, Lake Lorelei, and everywhere else. Everywhere but one place. Later on that day, Cheryl looked curiously down at the wooded forest area and asked if we ever explored there. Jimmy and I both felt strange and just said we don't go there often and gave no reason. Before she could ask more, we changed the subject to the carnival that evening and all the junk food we would eat and games we would play. The carnival was a blast, and it was dark when we arrived back to the property. Jimmy and his parents went to the shed, and Cheryl was sharing a bed with me in the camper. I was awakened in the middle of the night by Cheryl shaking me. From the look of her green face and the little light we had, it was obvious that Cheryl had overindulged in junk food. I woke my parents up and let them know that Cheryl was feeling very nauseous. Mom and Dad took her outside, and I followed. They took her around to the other side of the camper, and I took a seat at the picnic table in the front. There was a crescent moon that night, but the stars were very bright back then, and I could somewhat see in the darkness once my eyes became accustomed. I was sitting at the table with my back to the camper and facing the forest 5 lots down. I wasn't really paying too much attention when a figure walked towards the picnic table. I immediately assumed it was my Aunt Buela, as she would come out at night for smoke breaks. As the figure walked closer to me, I realized it was not my Aunt Buela, who had raven black hair and was short. This figure had pale blonde hair piled on top of her head and was very tall and slim. I stared at her aghast. It was the lady from the picture who Jimmy and I called Lorelei. She was very pale in the dim light, almost a bluish white. She sat down across from me at the picnic table, and I just stared at her, unable to form words. As she sat there eerily in the still night, suddenly she began to laugh. The same melodious laughter that I had heard in the old dilapidated house the summer before. And just as before, the laugh started to change. It became a shrill cackling, and as I looked at Lorelei, she also changed. It was not a gradual metamorphosis, it was an instant change. The beautiful blonde hair was gone. Her hair was now gray and hung in matted clumps down the back of her black hooded cloak. Her face was a greenish pale color, and it appeared that worms were moving around under her skin as the flesh undulated. Her teeth were brown and very sharp and pointed like the teeth of a shark rather than a person. I was frozen in place, unable to move or scream. The laugh turned to a screech, and the horrific figure across the table began reaching for me. Her fingers were very long and skinny, and she had sharp, pointy fingernails that started to scrape across my face. I suddenly was able to move, but still hadn't found my voice. I jumped up from the picnic table and began to run, unable to scream for help. I do not know why, but I found myself running barefoot across the road as fast as I could in the dark. As I kept running, not daring to look behind me, I heard her coming after me and gaining. As I looked in front of me, I realized that I was running foolishly straight to the pond. There was no way to verge off that course, and I began to panic. Lorelei was right behind me. I could smell her fetid breath. Once I reached the pond, there was nowhere to go. I turned to face her. Her eyes were glowing a fiery red in the dark. Her hands raised, reaching and grasping for me. Suddenly I found my voice. I closed my eyes and began screaming over and over, waiting for my fate. As I continued to scream, I felt someone's hand on my shoulder shaking me. It was my mom, and I was sitting at the picnic table, no longer by the pond. I was so confused. Mom asked me what was wrong with a look of extreme concern on her face. I was crying and trying to get it out. Lorelei, the horrible scream, the witchy appearance. Mom began hugging me and told me Lorelei was not real, and that I must have fallen asleep at the picnic table and had a nightmare. I knew that was not the case. It was real, and my feet still hurt from running across the sharp rocks barefoot. I knew Lorelei had been there that night, and that she was pure evil. We went back to bed, and it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning dawned as ever, and Sherry's parents came to take her back home. After she left, I grabbed Jimmy and told him I needed to speak with him, as I knew he would believe me and that it was no nightmare. I told him everything that had happened the night before. We decided to walk over to the pond and investigate. As we got close to the pond, to the spot where Lorelei had confronted me, looked down at the mud beside the water's edge, and there was one lone footprint. A bare footprint about the size of mine. I looked at Jimmy, and he looked at me. I slowly reached down and took my shoe off and placed it gingerly into the footprint. It was a perfect fit. I put my shoe on quickly, and Jimmy and I ran back to the camper. We both knew that Lorelei was real, no matter what the adults said, and we both vowed to never go out by ourselves after dark. The rest of the summer passed by quickly, and we never went to the forest or out alone past nightfall. Our parents never seemed to notice, and we just kept it as our secret. The summer ended, and it was back to school. Tragically, in the fall, Aunt Beulah died of a sudden heart attack. Everyone was grief-stricken and no longer wanted to go out to Lake Lorelei, as it wasn't the same without her. The property was sold, and I never returned to Lake Lorelei ever again. I still don't know exactly what went on that night long ago. As an adult, I'm sure now that the entity was not Lorelei, the siren from Norse mythology, but I am just as sure to this day that she was real. I still can't explain how I ended up back at the picnic table, but I know what really happened that night, and often wonder if the dilapidated house is still there all alone in the middle of the forest, and if Lorelei still haunts that land. Jimmy sadly passed away 2 years ago, and I no longer have anyone to discuss this frightening encounter with. At least no one that would believe me. Rest in peace. Jimmy, I dedicate this to you. Just outside of our small town resides a large estate, which has belonged to the same family for centuries. The story varies a bit upon whom you ask, but the name of the estate is Willowbrook, named after the family who built it. It has been abandoned for about 10 years. However, the last Willowbrook relatives that resided there had gained a bit of a reputation. Arthur and Maisie Willowbrook, a couple in their 60s, had seen of their youngest child a few years back, and so had took it upon themselves to start fostering kids. Only the children they took in seemed to come and go with alarming frequency. When Mrs. Willowbrook was seen doing her weekly food shop at the local supermarket, she always seemed to have a different child in tow. They did go on to adopt one of the children, a 10-year-old boy named Timothy. Timothy's schoolmates would remark that he was a quiet and withdrawn boy, and when asked about his adoptive parents would immediately clam up. Strangely, though he was the only child in their care that they allowed to attend school. Time passed and rumors grew. It was one early Friday morning that the sleepy atmosphere of the town was pierced by the wail of an ambulance siren as the vehicle rushed to the Willowbrook residence. Neighbors gathered at the end of the street that led to the estate and watched on in horror as little Timothy was carried on a stretcher into the ambulance. His left leg had been severed below the knee. The paramedics hurriedly tried to stem the flow of blood. The little boy was out cold and was quickly shuttled into the ambulance. As the vehicle drove off, the residents all shared stunned glances, and rumors flew that little Timmy had been injured by one or both of his parents. Only no arrests were ever made, much to the surprise of the local newspapers. Timmy eventually came back to school, now in a wheelchair. If he had been a quiet boy before, he now looked downright haunted. The other children gave him a wide berth, and he spent most of his time on his own, not talking to anyone. The Willowbrook couple were continuing to foster more children and had just taken in a set of identical twin girls. No more than a couple of years old, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girls delighted the local residents when they were spotted out and about with their foster mother, their cute antics and sunny smiles bringing joy to the locals. Time passed, and they too soon disappeared from sight. When questioned about their location, the old couple merely shrugged and said that the girls had been taken away by their biological parents. Things took a turn when a local child went missing one day, on their way home from school. A blue car has been seen near the vicinity of where the missing little boy was last seen, but no arrests were made, and the child remained missing. The locals started pointing fingers at the Willowbrooks, remarking that it was strange how the twin girls in their care had suddenly disappeared, and then not long after a local boy had gone missing. Mr. Willowbrook scoffed at the accusations and told the nosy neighbors to mind their own business. Years passed, and though it could be passed off as a coincidence due to the gaps between the abductions, 5 more local children disappeared over the span of 3 years. None of them were ever found, and it was a town-wide held belief that the Willowbrooks had something to do with the disappearances. Eventually, Mr. Willowbrook passed away from some medical issues, his wife Maisie following him a couple of years later. The Willowbrook estate now stood vacant and had fell into disrepair. Timothy was also nowhere to be found. The locals assumed he had been taken back into the foster care system, or had aged out of it and was living elsewhere. In the time since, arrogant teenagers who had heard the stories had dared each other to sneak into the old estate and search for clues about the missing children. The estate consisted of a main house and 3 small outer annexes. A large expanse of grassland and numerous heavily shaded trees surrounded the buildings. Most explorations proved fruitless, many of the kids being spooked by their own shadows and running away screaming. That was until my older brother and his friends all agreed to explore the abandoned estate one warm summer night. I had begged to go along with them, but my brother told me I was too young and he did not want to have to babysit his younger sister. Therefore, what I am about to tell you comes from my brother's own mouth. My brother and 3 of his friends snuck through a hole in the wall of the brick structure that surrounded the estate. They moved silently and waited to ensure no one had spotted them trespassing from outside. Despite the overgrown grass, it was a short walk to the main house. It was 3 stories high and still stood grand and tall despite the clear state of disrepair. They walked up the few steps to the entrance, and my brother pushed on the large oak door. It creaked loudly and swung slightly inwards, fist bumping each for their stroke of luck. Torches in hand, the 4 boys entered the house. Despite the light summer evening, the inside was dark and shaded. Bringing torches had been a good call. They explored each room one by one, the main entrance, living room, another sitting room, and finally entered the impressive kitchen. The walls were lined with numerous cupboards, many of the doors now cracked or hanging off. A large counter sat in the middle of the room, and a variety of pots, pans, and cutlery were scattered across it. Yet it was none of these things that captured the boys' attention. As soon as they had entered the room, they were hit with a god-awful smell. My brother gagged and pulled the neck of his hoodie up over his nose and mouth. He flicked his eyes around the room, and they landed on the old-fashioned refrigerator. It was covered in layers of dirt and grime, and the door to it was cracked open. As he got closer, that vile smell grew stronger. He drew closer and, reaching out a tentative hand, pulled the fridge door open. The smell and sight before his eyes made him double over and retch. A human skull sat dead center on one of the shelves, its lower jaw missing. Old red and brown stains littered the inside of the fridge, and suspicious-looking containers sat scattered around it. My brother scrambled back and told his friends they needed to get the hell of there. Knowing something was badly wrong due to the smell, they took him at his word. The four boys ran back through the house, tripping over furniture in their haste. It was only when crawling back through the hole in the wall that my brother finally took a breath and explained what he had seen. His friends looked at him in horror and debated whether to report their findings to the police. Having been trespassing, my brother was reluctant to do so. After much deliberating, my brother and his friends drove to a phone box far away from the house and made an anonymous report to the police. The story blew up and police searched the estate from top to bottom. They uncovered the remains of more than 20 children on the property, 5 of which were confirmed to be the remains of the missing children. The town was shocked and outraged, and so campaigned for the murder house to be demolished. Unfortunately, the authorities have not been able to track down any living Willowbrook relatives, and they are unwilling to demolish the house without consulting the family first. Though the police have never confirmed the details of the children's deaths, it is believed that Macy and Arthur were cannibals and preyed on the weak. These seemingly caring individuals invited innocent children into their home only to gruesomely end their lives. Now the truth has come to light. Our seemingly idyllic little town will never be the same again. The warm breeze of a late August evening caressed my skin as I made my way down the familiar path to Crescent Beach. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a Friday night, and as usual, I was meeting up with my 3 best friends, Jake, Sarah, and Mike. We had been inseparable since middle school, bonded by our shared love of the outdoors and a curiosity about the world around us. Now, on the cusp of our senior year in high school, we were savoring these last carefree summer nights before the pressure of college applications and adult responsibilities began to weigh on us. As I approached our usual spot at the far end of the beach, I could see the silhouettes of my friends already seated on the weathered wooden bench. The lone streetlight in the middle of the beach cast a faint, eerie glow that barely reached our secluded cul-de-sac. "Hey guys," I called out, quickening my pace as I drew nearer. Jake looked up and waved, his sandy blonde hair ruffling in the breeze. "About time you showed up," he teased, a grin spreading across his face. Sarah scooted over to make room for me on the bench. Her dark curls were pulled back in a messy bun, and she was wearing her favorite oversized hoodie despite the warm evening. "We were starting to think you'd bailed on us," she said, bumping my shoulder playfully as I sat down. Mike, always the practical one, was fiddling with a small telescope he'd brought along. "The sky's supposed to be really clear tonight," he explained, not looking up from his task. "I thought we might do some stargazing." I leaned back on the bench, feeling the rough wood beneath my palms. "Sounds perfect," I said, tilting my head back to look at the first few stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. We fell into our usual easy banter, discussing our plans for the weekend, debating which teachers we hoped to have for our senior year classes, and speculating about the upcoming football season. The hours slipped by unnoticed, our laughter echoing across the empty beach. As the night wore on, a comfortable silence fell over us. We sat there listening to the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore, each lost in our own thoughts. It was peaceful, serene, until it wasn't. It happened so suddenly that at first I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. Jake, who had been gazing absently towards the tree line that bordered the beach, suddenly stiffened. His eyes widened, and he raised a trembling hand to point at something in the distance. "Guys," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves, "look over there." We all turned to follow his gaze, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the woods, illuminated by the faint glow of the distant streetlight, was a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, impossibly unnaturally tall. Its limbs were long and spindly, reminiscent of tree branches in winter, stripped bare of leaves. The creature's silhouette was stark against the backdrop of the forest, its legs spread apart in an oddly mechanical stance. For a moment we all sat frozen, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. It couldn't be real, I told myself. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe a weirdly shaped tree that we had never noticed before. But then it moved. The creature bent forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it did so, I caught a glimpse of its hands, if you could call them that. They were more like claws with fingers that seemed to stretch on forever, tipped with nails that looked sharp enough to tear through flesh with ease. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. I couldn't answer. My throat had gone dry, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. As we watched in horror, the creature dropped to all fours, its body contorting in ways that no human body ever could. And then it ran. It moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something of its size, scuttling across the sand like some nightmarish spider. In a matter of seconds, it had disappeared into the dense foliage of the woods, leaving behind nothing but the echo of rustling leaves and our own terrified gasps. For a moment, we sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what we had just witnessed. Then, as if a spell had been broken, we all scrambled to our feet at once. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, already backing away from the bench. No one argued. Without a word, we turned and ran, our feet pounding against the sand as we sprinted towards the safety of the lit streets beyond the beach. We didn't stop until we reached Jake's house, the closest to the beach, slamming the door behind us and collapsing in his living room, out of breath and shaking with fear. For a long time, none of us spoke. We just sat there, trying to catch our breath and make sense of what we had seen. Jake's parents were out for the evening, leaving the house eerily quiet save for the sound of our ragged breathing. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. What was that thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, still struggling to find words. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never seen anything like it before." Mike, always the logical one, tried to rationalize what we had witnessed. "Maybe it was just someone playing a prank," he suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We all knew that what we had seen was no prank. "Did you see how tall it was?" Jake said, his eyes wide with remembered fear. "And those fingers, those weren't human fingers." A shudder ran through me at the memory. The image of those impossibly long skeletal fingers was seared into my mind. I doubted I would ever forget it. "Should we tell someone?" Sarah asked, looking around at each of us uncertainly. I considered this for a moment before shaking my head. Who would believe us? We don't have any proof. They'd just think we were making it up or that we were drunk or high or something. The others nodded reluctantly, knowing I was right. We were completely sober. We didn't even drink, let alone do drugs. But who would believe 4 teenagers claiming to have seen some kind of monster on the beach? "So what do we do?" Mike asked, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we should avoid the beach for a while, especially at night." There were murmurs of agreement from the others. None of us were eager to return to the scene of our terrifying encounter. As the initial shock began to wear off, we started to discuss what we had seen in more detail, trying to make sense of it. We described what we had witnessed to each other, comparing notes and filling in gaps in each other's memories. "It was so skinny," Sarah recalled with a shudder. "I could see its bones through its skin." Jake nodded. "And the way it moved. It wasn't natural. No animal moves like that." We talked late into the night, rehashing every detail of our encounter. By the time we finally decided to call it a night and head to our respective homes, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. As I walked home, my mind was racing. What had we seen? Was it some kind of undiscovered creature, a monster from folklore come to life? Or was there a more rational explanation that we were simply too scared to see? I didn't have answers to any of these questions, but I knew one thing for certain. My life would never be the same again. In the days that followed our encounter on the beach, I found myself consumed by a need to understand what we had seen. I spent hours online searching for any information that might shed light on the creature we had encountered. At first, my searches yielded nothing but frustration. There were plenty of stories about mythical creatures and cryptids, but none of them quite matched what we had seen. The closest I could find were legends of skinwalkers from Native American folklore, or the Wendigo of Algonquian myth, but even these didn't quite fit. I delved deeper, spending late nights poring over obscure forums and websites dedicated to paranormal encounters. I read countless stories of people claiming to have seen strange creatures in the woods or on lonely roads at night. Some of these accounts sent chills down my spine, bearing eerie similarities to our own experience. As I immersed myself in this world of cryptozoology and paranormal research, I began to realize just how vast and mysterious our world truly was. There were so many things that science couldn't explain, so many experiences that defied rational understanding. I shared my findings with my friends, but their reactions were mixed. Sarah was as intrigued as I was, eagerly helping me with my research. Mike remained skeptical, always looking for logical explanations. Jake, on the other hand, wanted nothing more to do with it. The experience had shaken him deeply, and he preferred to try and forget it had ever happened. Despite the differences in our reactions, the experience had bonded us in a way that nothing else could. We were the only ones who knew what we had seen that night, the only ones who could truly understand the fear and confusion we had felt. As the weeks passed, life slowly began to return to normal. We cautiously returned to the beach, but only during the day, and never to our old spot at the far end. We laughed and joked like we always had, but there was an undercurrent of tension now, a shared secret that set us apart from everyone else. It was almost 2 months after our initial encounter when it happened again. We had grown complacent, convinced that whatever we had seen that night had been a one-time occurrence. We were wrong. It was a warm Saturday evening, and we had decided to have a bonfire on the beach. We chose a spot close to the parking lot, well lit and usually busy with other beachgoers. We felt safe there, surrounded by the chatter of other groups and the glow of nearby streetlights. As the night wore on, the beach gradually emptied. By midnight, we were the only ones left, but we weren't worried. We were close to our cars, and the memory of that night had faded enough that we felt secure. We were in the middle of roasting marshmallows when Sarah suddenly went rigid, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the fire. I followed her gaze, and my blood ran cold. There, at the edge of the light cast by our fire, stood the creature. It was just as I remembered, impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. But this time I could see more details. Its skin was a sickly, pale gray, stretched taut over protruding bones. Its face, if you could call it that, was a blank, featureless expanse with no discernible eyes, nose, or mouth. Yet somehow I knew it was looking right at us. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other across the flickering firelight. Then, with a movement so fast it was almost invisible, the creature turned and vanished into the darkness. We didn't wait around this time. We doused the fire and ran to our cars, our hearts pounding with renewed terror. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just narrowly escaped something terrible. That second encounter changed everything. We could no longer pretend that what we had seen was a one-time thing, a trick of the light or a figment of our imaginations. Whatever this creature was, it was real, and it was still out there. We gathered at my house the next day for an emergency meeting. The atmosphere was tense, filled with a mix of fear, excitement, and determination. "We can't ignore this anymore," I said, looking around at my friends. "Whatever this thing is, it's dangerous. We need to do something about it." Sarah nodded in agreement. "But what can we do? We're just a bunch of kids. Who's going to believe us?" Mike, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Maybe we don't need anyone to believe us. Maybe we need to handle this ourselves." We all stared at him in surprise. Mike had always been the cautious one, the voice of reason. To hear him suggest something so reckless was shocking. "What do you mean, handle it ourselves?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with fear and curiosity. Mike took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been doing some research of my own. There are people out there, cryptozoologists, paranormal investigators, who take this kind of thing seriously. Maybe we could reach out to them, see if they can help us figure out what we're dealing with." I nodded slowly, considering the idea. "It's worth a shot. But we need to be careful. We don't want to attract attention from the wrong people." We spent the rest of the day making plans. We decided to create an anonymous email account to reach out to experts in the field of cryptozoology. We would share our story, but be careful not to reveal too much about our identities or location. As we worked, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. We were embarking on something bigger than ourselves, stepping into a world of mystery and danger that we barely understood. But we were in it together, and that gave me courage. Little did we know, our decision that day would set us on a path that would change our lives forever. The creature on the beach was just the beginning. There was a whole world of the unknown out there, waiting to be discovered, and we were about to dive headfirst into it. Our email to the cryptozoology community didn't go unnoticed. Within days, we received a response from Dr. Elena Reeves, a respected researcher in the field of cryptozoology. She was intrigued by our account and wanted to know more. We arranged a video call with Dr. Reeves, taking care to obscure our backgrounds and use only our first names. As her face appeared on the screen, I was struck by how normal she looked. I had expected someone eccentric, but Dr. Reeves could have been any college professor. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. We're not sure what to do about what we've seen." Dr. Reeves nodded, her expression serious. "I understand. Can you describe the creature in as much detail as possible?" We took turns recounting our experiences, describing the creature's appearance and behavior. Dr. Reeves listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, but otherwise remaining silent. When we finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "What you've described," she said finally, "doesn't match any known cryptid exactly. It has elements of several legends, the height and thinness of the slender man, the speed and quadrupedal movement of certain werewolf myths, the emaciated appearance of the Wendigo, but the combination is unique." "So what does that mean?" Sarah asked, leaning forward eagerly. Dr. Reeves sighed. "It means we're dealing with something potentially new, or at least something that hasn't been widely reported before." She went on to explain that many cryptid sightings shared common elements, often influenced by local folklore or pop culture. But occasionally, there were reports of creatures that didn't fit any known pattern. "These are the cases that interest me the most," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "They suggest that there might be undiscovered species out there or phenomena that we don't yet understand." "So what should we do?" I asked, both thrilled and terrified by the possibilities she was suggesting. Dr. Reeves's expression turned serious again. "First and foremost, stay safe. Don't try to seek this creature out. If you see it again, maintain your distance and try to document the encounter if you can do so safely." She gave us tips on how to gather evidence, taking photos or videos if possible, making detailed notes immediately after an encounter while the memory was fresh, looking for physical evidence like footprints or hair. "But remember," she cautioned, "your safety is the most important thing. No piece of evidence is worth risking your lives for." As the call ended, I felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was exciting to think that we might be on the verge of a significant discovery. On the other, the reality of the danger we were in was starting to sink in. We had sought answers, but instead we had only found more questions. What was this creature? Where had it come from? And most importantly, what did it want? Despite Dr. Reeves's warnings, we couldn't resist the temptation to investigate further. We decided to set up a stakeout, choosing a spot on a hill overlooking the beach where we had first seen the creature. We prepared carefully, bringing cameras with night vision capabilities, voice recorders, and even a few motion-activated trail cameras that Mike had borrowed from his uncle, an avid hunter. We also made sure to bring plenty of food, water, and warm clothes. If we were going to do this, we were going to do it right. The night of the stakeout was cool and clear, the stars twinkling brightly overhead. We set up our equipment and settled in for a long night of waiting. For hours nothing happened. We talked in hushed voices, sharing stories and speculating about what we might see. As the night wore on, our excitement began to wane, replaced by fatigue and a creeping sense of disappointment. It was just past 2 a.m. when Sarah suddenly grabbed my arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing towards the tree line. At first I saw nothing, then a shadow moved. It was subtle, barely perceptible in the dim moonlight, but it was there. We all held our breath, cameras at the ready. Slowly, impossibly, the creature emerged from the woods. It moved with that same unnatural gait we had seen before, its long limbs carrying it across the sand with eerie grace. In the pale moonlight, its skin seemed to shimmer, almost translucent. Mike fumbled with his camera, his hands shaking as he tried to focus. Jake was frozen in place, his eyes wide with fear and fascination. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, silently confirming that we were both seeing the same thing. The creature paused at the water's edge, its featureless face turning towards the sea. For a moment it stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from pale stone. Then, with a movement so fast it was almost invisible, it plunged into the water. We waited, cameras trained on the spot where it had disappeared, but it didn't resurface. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we realized it wasn't coming back. In the days that followed, we pored over the footage we had captured. To our amazement and relief, we had clear video evidence of the creature. We immediately sent it to Dr. Reeves, who was as excited as we were. What happened next was a whirlwind. Dr. Reeves arrived in our town with a team of researchers. The beach was cordoned off, and a thorough investigation was launched. Marine biologists were called in to study the waters where the creature had disappeared. Weeks turned into months. The investigation drew international attention. Theories abounded. Was it an undiscovered species, an alien, a government experiment gone wrong? The world was captivated by the mystery, but for us, the four friends who had first encountered the creature, life changed in ways we never expected. We were hailed as young heroes in the scientific community. Our futures, once uncertain, now seemed filled with possibility. Universities offered us scholarships, eager to have us study biology, marine science, or cryptozoology. As for the creature itself, it was never seen again. Some speculated that it had returned to the depths of the ocean, to whatever world it had come from. Others believed it was still out there, waiting to be rediscovered. In the end, the truth remained elusive. But that night on the beach had opened our eyes to the wonders and mysteries of the world. It had shown us that there was still so much to discover, so much that we didn't understand. As I sit here now, years later, writing this account, I can't help but smile. That terrifying encounter changed the course of our lives, setting us on paths we never could have imagined. Sarah became a renowned marine biologist, Mike a cutting-edge wildlife photographer, Jake a best-selling author of science fiction inspired by our experience, and me, I followed in Dr. Reeves's footsteps, becoming a cryptozoologist, always searching for the next great mystery. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself drawn back to that beach. I stand at the water's edge, looking out at the vast, dark ocean, and I wonder, is it still out there? Will we ever truly understand what we saw that night? But then I remind myself that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. And in a world where we think we have all the answers, it's these unsolved mysteries that keep us curious, that drive us to explore and discover. Our encounter with the creature on the beach may have ended, but in many ways it was just the beginning of a lifelong journey into the unknown. And for that, despite the fear and uncertainty we felt that night, I will always be grateful.